Hello, everybody. This is Arnold. This is the Cherry Hill Seminary podcast. Cherry Hill Seminary serves pagan and nature-based communities by providing high-quality education, allowing students to succeed academically and lead spiritually. Our guest on the podcast today is Dr. Robert Patrick. Robert, go ahead and introduce yourself. I'll let you introduce yourself to the audience. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little about yourself and your relationship to paganism? Let's start with that.
Sure. That's quite a big ask, but I'm glad to be here with you and here are some things about me. So I am uh recently in the last 3 years retired as an educator from mostly public school, teaching high school Latin. I have a PhD in Latin and classical studies and have done a lot of my teaching around that. Although across many of those 32 years, I've also done adjunct teaching in Latin, in classics, in theology, in spirituality, and that's sort of where Cherry Hill comes in. I'll back up for a moment to say I was born and raised in a rural part of the northern part of Alabama, just north of Birmingham in that community was sort of in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and so I grew up in a rural setting. I love to point out to people who use the term pagan that paganus is a Latin term that just means somebody who lives in the countryside. That's what it was originally. Of course, the term has taken on many different levels of meaning, and I won't lecture there. I'll just say that for me, early on in my life, I made deep connections to nature, to the woods, to the creatures that live in the woods, and that shaped me more than I could ever have imagined. I grew up in Protestant Christianity in the Methodist Church. I went to seminary with the Methodist Church and was ordained as a United Methodist minister, where I served for 8 years in parish ministry. I left Methodism in search of truth and meaning for myself, and went to the Catholic Church, where my family and I participated for 12 years. And then we left church altogether for a while. And it was during that time, and I would have been in my late 30s, early 40s, where I began to explore modern Druidry as a spiritual path for myself and entered also into Unitarian Universalism, where I've been a member now for over 20 years. Um, I mean, that's sort of the big sketch of how my path has unfolded. It's always been for me about what's meaningful? What else can add broader and deeper meaning to how I understand life, my life, your life, our collective life together, the life of the earth? I love to think of the earth as our mother and all of her children, not just the human ones, but all of her children. And that's sort of guided the way that I see things. As far as Cherry Hill goes, in the mid 2000s, so about 20 years ago, I found them, discovered them online, and reached out and said, I'm interested in um, teaching with you if I have some skills that would work for you. And that, in short, began a long and happy relationship with me and Cherry Hill. I've been teaching on and off courses in the Masters of Divinity program all that time, mostly courses in spirituality, some in theology and ethics, um, and uh, and now that's become a joint effort between Cherry Hill Seminary and United Theological Seminary, which is a United Church of Christ seminary. And I just taught a course in understanding the ritual experience. And I'm slated to teach again next year a course in Introduction to Pagan Theologies.
Can you tell us a little bit about the classes that you have taught or are teaching now? If I'm not mistaken, you were just an instructor for the last semester, were you not?
Yes.
You
I
want to tell us
was.
about that class?
Yeah, that class was called Understanding the Ritual Experience. And the aim of the class was to invite students into reflection on all the components that go into good and meaningful ritual, regardless of what kind of ritual it is in terms of, religious perspective or religious content. I tried to make that course, and again, this was a joint course. There were Cherry Hill students, there were United Theological Seminary students, and I tried to give students in every lecture or every session, there were 15 sessions for the semester, some experiential kinds of things. They were to prepare readings, for example, that they might use in a ritual of their own making, but they had to bring the reading in and offer the reading as if it were in a ritual. And then the classmates who were listening gave them feedback about things they did that made it connect for them, or made it meaningful to them, or made them curious about more. So there was a little hands-on experiential aspect. We engaged in a brief ritual at the beginning of every class, and then did some reflection on that ritual. I did a lecture, a sort of a mini lecture. I don't think that professor talking for an hour is the best way to learn. So I prepared some mini lectures around the various things that shape ritual. Like, so there's shaping and there's meaning making. And it's kind of like the push and the pull of a ritual. There are things that people bring into a ritual, but there are things that the ritual itself gives back to people. And so we examine themes like that. We examined the content, the kinds of content that might be brought into a ritual. We talked about the way that we set up for ritual. What does the space look like? And I gave them the example of my own experience in our UU congregation, where for a while, years ago, all the chairs were lined up in straight rows from front to back, and it felt like a lecture hall. And it felt, even if there were 75 or 100 people in the room, we all felt disconnected from each other. But when we rearranged those chairs to be a semicircle, there was not a seat in the house where you couldn't see everyone in the house. It felt more connected. It felt like we were in something together. So just the simple aspect of rearranging seating, thinking about what kinds of symbols you want to use, what kind of language you want to use. We spent a good bit of time on story and the role that story plays in every ritual. Whether you're telling a story or not, there's an implicit story. And to be more explicit about stories tends to make a ritual more powerful. And so when they came in to practice their readings in class, they were invited to try and make those readings a story or story-like. And then we examined how the story was functioning as well. It pressed some students who were not really clear about their own paths to ask the question, what stories are informing my life? And what's, for the benefit and even sometimes for the harm. We walk around telling ourselves stories all the time that are not all that useful or not all that healthy. And so pressing the question of, what story do you want to tell? If you were creating a ritual, what would the story be about? And then, one other component of the course was asking them to reinvent a ritual, a rite of passage, and to come at that with some creativity. So it felt to me like it was a lively, creative set of experiences, and I got a lot of positive feedback in that regard as well.
Hmm. That sounds very interesting. I have always likened the writing of a ritual to be something like a play, a performance, and you have to tell a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
Um, Let me ask you, what you had mentioned that ritual gives back to people. Besides the spiritual benefit of performing a ritual, how important do you think that is for an individual? And is there a difference in the kind of benefit a person receives individually, or is it different than what they might receive in a group?
I do think there's some differences. I mean, I tend to support both the solitary use of ritual and the communal. In fact, both are very important to me, but they do end up being different kinds of experiences. With a solitary ritual, and pause for some information. What we know from surveys is that a large chunk of people who identify as pagan or as being on an earth nurturing path, a large chunk of them, I think it's 40+%, identify as solitaries. They're not a part of a community. So we can't ignore that. Having said that, um, in a solitary ritual, one has the luxury of flexibility of time and space. If a piece of the ritual that I'm doing as a solitary is really alive for me in this moment, I can pause there and I can explore it in a direction that might be more difficult in a communal ritual. On the other hand, in a communal ritual, if you think of every human being that is participating in a ritual as a vessel of the divine, and I've gathered with 5 or 10 or 15 or 35 other people, there are all these other vessels of the divine that are present and at work. And so, very often in a communal ritual, an experience will begin to take shape that you couldn't have scripted. It just it just wasn't in the script, and yet the script led to this moment where something unexpected happened. So they are different experiences, even if the solitary person and the community are working with the same script.
Mm, wonderful. Speaking of story and ritual, you had in our communications prior to today, you uh, or I had learned that you had come across a story which had a pretty big impact on you, so much so that you decided to sit down and write a book about it.
That's
Um, I
true.
think I think you know the stories I'm talking about. I hope I don't butcher it. The Tuatha de Danann, is
So
that
this
right?
is, yeah, this is a group of people. My understanding is it's best pronounced Trois de
Mhm.
Danann.
Okay, thank you. So why don't you tell us about that story and how you came across it first and what that I guess how that led to inspiring you to sit down and explore it for yourself. Tell us first about the story that impacted you.
Sure, sure. So in retrospect, I came across this story, and this story exists in fragmentary form. In other words, we have this document called the Kamatura. The Kamatura looks like it should be Kathmage Tweerid, but it's pronounced Kamatura. We have this document called the Kamatura, and it's about two different battles of this group of people called the Tuatha. And I had come across this document numerous times in my own studies of Irish Irish lore, ancient Irish lore. I had come across it several times, and each time I came across the story, it was the very beginning of the story that just absolutely captured my imagination, and I had no explanation for that. And here's the piece of the story that got my attention. So as the story goes in the Kamatura, there was this group of beings. I've already called them people. Um, Scholars will argue, were they human beings who became deities? Were they deities from the beginning? Were they human beings who became heroic and later legend turned them into deities? We don't know. But they were known as the Tuatha Dé Danann, which means the children of Danu. Danu is one of the divine feminine beings of Ireland. And they were sailing towards Ireland with the understanding that they were to take over the leadership of this island that we know as Ireland. But before they were allowed to set foot on shore, it became clear to them that they had to sail around to the north, to the islands of the north, where they would study magic, the magic that they needed in order to do what they were set to do, what their destiny was to do. And so the story says that they went to the Isles of the North, and there they studied in 4 cities from 4 druid wizards and learned the magic that they would need. And that from each of those 4 cities, they brought back with them a talisman that served as a portal to the magic that they were learning. And they would bring these 4 talismans back to the center of the land of Ireland and keep them there as their vehicle through to the magic they needed. that just fascinated me because it immediately felt to me like more than a story. It felt like something archetypal, and so it began to invite my imagination in to where were these cities? What was the magic they studied? And it does tell us what the four talismans were. The the four talismans were the Stone of Fall, the Sword of Nuadu, the Spear of Lu, and the Cauldron of the Dagda. So they named these talismans, and it's interesting because three of the four are named with members of the Tuatha De Danann who become famous in the rest of the story of the Kamatura. And so there's even some time lapse play in the telling of this story. You're telling me up front that they brought these talismans, these four talismans back from the Isles of the North, but they're already named for individuals in the group who will become famous for what they did in the playing out of the battles. I don't have a way to explain that, except that these things really captured my imagination. So I set about working with the story and those four talisman as as something that could be meaningful in my own spiritual life. And I did this over several years until it began to become clear to me that I was engaging in a devotion to these, with these, through these four talismans, through to the divine. And over time, I developed a devotional practice. And after some time practicing that devotional practice every day, really, for a couple of years, every day I was doing this devotional practice, it became clear that they were shaping me. And that began to feel like some sort of an initiatory experience. And beyond that, that having worked with the four talisman for this length of time in this devotional and initiatory way, that they were also vehicles of my own magic working in the world, which raises the question, what is magic and how does that happen in the modern world? So this story, and as I say, it's fragmentary. The story doesn't tell us all the things that we would love to know about the Tuatha De Danann and these four talismans and how they use them, but it does invite us to ask how they might be at work in us.
Real quick, you had mentioned the stories are fragmented. Is there was it because these are very ancient stories that started as oral stories that were passed down, or were the records just destroyed? Is it kind of like an ancient Egyptian scenario going on? Why are the stories so fragmented? Or do you
Yeah,
know?
so there are a number of factors that go into that, and I will say to you that I don't pretend to be a Celtic scholar. If anything, I'm a scholar of classical Roman and Latin and Greek literature, but some of these skills that I have in that arena play into this arena, and I've leaned heavily on Celtic scholars that I respect for some of this. They're fragmentary, yes. They were oral stories that were told for the longest time by uh, uh, tribes of people, the Celtic tribes in general, which span across much of Western Europe, but certainly in Ireland, were people who kept their stories orally. That was part of being in the Druidic order, is that you had to memorize the oral stories in poetic form and prove yourself across a long span of time to be able to do that. So they were oral. They were held by a group of people who valued the oral over the written. And so by the time these stories are written down, they're being written down apparently by Christian monks who have now entered into Ireland from the Catholic Church. And so we can be grateful to the monastic scholars for taking the time to write the stories down, but they're also fragmentary because they made changes to the stories as well. In some respects, they took what had been a Celtic Irish story and rewrote it as if it were a story about Jesus and Mary. And so
Mm.
in the Kamatura, that doesn't happen as much as it does in some other documents. And then finally, and you've already said it, because the Kamatura, my understanding is, comes to us as a 10th or 11th century document. Um, but at that point, it's already a copy of what would have been a much older document. So the passage of time takes its toll on complete copies of these documents as well. There's another one that I love to work with and have worked with even a little bit longer, called in English it's called the Cauldron of Poesy. It's even more fragmentary. It's about the inner life of the bard and how that works spiritually and energetically. And it just tells us some amazing things and then is just chopped off because that's all there is of it. And it's a 14th century document that we think was a copy of a 7th century document, but the 7th century document doesn't exist. So you have those kinds of historic realities at play, that each in their own right make sense and leave us with something less than a complete document.
Hmm. What was it that made you go from discovering these stories to taking the time to write several hundred pages on the topic for the benefit of other people? Because I imagine you could have just taken this information for yourself and made it a personal practice. What made you want to sit down and write? Also, please tell us the name of your book, The Four Talismans,
Yeah,
for the
it's called The Four Talismans: Devotion, Initiation, and Magic, which, as you well know, is being published by Cherry Hill Seminary.
Mhm.
Um, your question already sort of taps into the reality for the longest time, because as I said, I was working with this story personally for several years. I just thought this will just be something that I work with personally because I just didn't. I don't know. I just didn't think beyond that point. But the more I worked with it, the more it felt to me like, and honestly, in the midst of meditation, I got some nudges from spirit that I should check into the possibility of publishing these experiences, these these modern ways of working with ancient symbols, because and part of that is because I get asked all the time by people in my Druid group, by students, what is there for me to reach out to? What sources are there for me to follow? What can you recommend for me? And there are. In fact, I just spent several hours this week creating a reading list that I would recommend to people who are interested in the Druid path. And of course, it's got my new book on there because it's a body of work that I would recommend somebody check out. If you're interested in a Druid path, if you're interested in, if you feel drawn to things that are Irish and Celtic and ancient, and some of those ancient stories, you might be drawn to this, because I was. And that was it. That was the motivation. It was just beginning with something that was very personal work and beginning to feel more and more like, hmm, somebody else might be interested in this also.
Mhm.
I
I can
also,
say,
well, I also just want to add to that in general, there is this yearning in me that is drawn by good stories to ask, well, how is that speaking to me? What is the message of that to me? And so this was also an opportunity for me to, I'm going to use the word with great honor, to play with what already excites me a great deal, and that's working with story like this.
yeah, I'll bet. As a writer myself, I understand exactly what you're talking about. And as one of the first people to have read your manuscript, I can vouch for the amount of detail that goes into not only telling what is known about the stories, but then incorporating that into a devotional practice. And
Mhm.
for the audience who has not so far been able to read your book, which by the time this is released should be completely available. Um, what can readers expect to learn from your book as far as is it a lot, or I'm sorry, is it more devotional? Is there a mention of magic? Is it purely meditational? Are there physical rituals? What can we expect if we pick it up?
Yeah, so I tried to set this up in a way that reflected my own experience. I started out with a fairly lengthy introduction about my own path, and then um, what we know basically from a scholarly perspective about this story and its pieces, which we've been talking about already. I move then into a chapter on each of the talismans. the background that we have historically and literarily about each talisman, and then some investigation into what this talisman can mean for us living in the modern world. And that's where it shifts from academic information to spiritual experience and spiritual exploration. And I do that in 4 chapters, one for each of the talisman. Beyond that, I have a chapter on using the 4 talisman in a devotional experience, and I supply them with the complete script of the devotional that I wrote years ago and have continued to sort of refine ever since then. There's a copy of the entire script, both in the chapter and in the appendix, so that if they wanted to just go there, because in the chapter I have the script with a commentary about gestures that can be used and postures that can be used and the way that one can set up an altar if one wants to. Altar not required, but some people love to do that. I happen to be one of those. But I've also, as I say in the book, I've done this devotion sitting on an airplane, without anybody around me knowing what I was doing. So I also talk about that, about the way the devotion can be used in one's life. Then there's a chapter on initiation because, as I've said, when we engage in something often enough, and that something is meaningful, that begins to offer itself back to us as a kind of shaping of our lives. One of the most important sort of symbols for me in my modern Druid practice is an ancient symbol or an ancient way of looking at the world called the 3 realms, the sky and the earth and the sea. Well, I work with sky, earth, and sea as words, as symbols, as daily practices for so long now that it has shaped everything that I see. And that's an initiatory experience. So there's a chapter in there about if you work with this at the four talisman as a devotion, you may begin to feel that it's becoming initiatory. And I suggest some ways to engage in a personal initiation into the 4 talismans. Then there's a chapter on magic itself. I say up front in the book, there are lots of great definitions of magic, and I've read several different books on magic, and I love the way each author defines it. I've borrowed one from an author named Aidan Wachter, whose work I really found very helpful to me. And his is the simplest. Magic is an art of change or an art of transformation, an art of change. And I love that because it doesn't try to define what's being changed. If I engage in a magical ritual or a magical act, I like to think of prayer spells because I think that prayer and spell work or magical work have a lot in common. Um, when we engage in a magical working, something's changing, even if it's just inside of me. And it may be that it's changing in the people that I'm doing the work with. And it may be that there's something changing in the world because of what we're doing. But we do these actions with the intent that we are engaging in an art of change. And so there's in the chapter on magic, I suggest ways to do those kinds of prayer spells or magical workings with each of the 4 talismans, and even an example of how to do the work with all 4 at once. Beyond that, there's a, a chapter that I call a mystics theology because I feel like a lot of this work falls under the category of mysticism, practical mysticism, if you will, because I feel like it's livable in the world, has to be livable in the world. Um, and so I attempt to make sense of a theology, a way of looking at and understanding the divine that fits with what I've been proposing through this story in the book. I don't know how useful people will find that to be. Some people will say, "Why didn't you make this the first chapter?" And other people might say, "Why did you include this at all?" I think having a theological framework strikes people at different places in their lives very differently. The last chapter of the book is my personal retelling of the story of the Tuatha Dé Danann going to study magic in 4 cities with 4 Druid wizards and what they did with that magic. It's me filling in the blanks with my own imagination. And that's I think one more thing I'd like to say, Arnold. Throughout the book, I make constant reference to the importance and the power of our imaginations. I have learned through spiritual practices with my own spiritual director, a Jungian practice called active imagination. And it's the simple and powerful practice of engaging characters and scenes and stories in conversation with our own soul and mind and allowing them to speak to us. And so that last chapter where I retell the story in my own words is the product of that, of having conversations with the talismans, having conversations with the Druid teachers they went to study with, having conversations with some of the Tuatha De Danann in my own imagination, and then trying to rewrite the story.
Mm. Um, I believe I remember reading, I think it was something that you had written. I believe it was in the book or it may have been in an email, but you drew the distinction that this is not Reconstructionism. Can you
Right.
explore that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important thing to address. There are in a variety of religious practices, there are especially of ancient and indigenous practices, there are people who see themselves reconstructing the ancient religion, and I have respect for them. I have investigated those kinds of approaches and decided that that's that's not for me, and for the people that I work with in my community, um, that's a hard sell as well, because none of us are living in 7th century Ireland. And let's be really clear, I'm a white guy living in the United States of America. I'm not in Ireland at all. I've been to Ireland. I have ancestry from Ireland, but I'm not an Irish person. And so what I want to be really careful to say is I have been constructing a modern Druid path for myself. And what that means is that I have received the gift of stories and symbols and images from many Celtic cultured lands. And when they speak to me, I want to embrace them with honor and weave them into my path. That's what this work is about. So I'm really careful to say that I'm on a modern Druid path. I'm not an ancient Druid. Nobody is from my perspective because we're all living here in the 21st century and we're facing realities, including just our technology that would be utterly different, maybe even obscene to ancient Celts who highly honored oral tradition. So there are realities about each of our own experiences, the ancients and we moderns, that I think require our respect and our realistic approach to.
Mentioning the four talismans, I'm sure there are many people in the audience who have experience with Wicca. Is the four talismans kind of treated like, are they treated like the four elements? Is there that sort of deep symbolism to the four talismans?
Yeah, so there probably is some overlap. I mean, in Wicca and Druidry have lots of overlap as well because they both, at least in current expressions, tend to draw on Celtic, Irish, Welsh, Scottish, Brittonic, English, French, German, Scandinavian, all of those places, even parts of northern Spain, had Celtic tribes living in them with various expressions. They both modern versions draw on a lot of that imagery. I would say that the difference is well, there are a number of things going on here with the four elements, for instance, fire, um,
Earth.
water, earth, and air. Those can be seen as energies. They can be seen as energies that are always present and which are called into a ritual to help in the magical working. The talismans, I think that the best word that I have for them is portals, that they're like energetic windows that can open through from this side to the other side. And the other side for me is the realm of spirit. And each of the talismans, because of what it is, conveys a certain kind of energy through from the other side. So, for instance, the Stone of Fall is is about grounding and sovereignty. When you work with the stone of fall, it's a portal that opens you to almost instantly once you've become familiar with working to it, almost instantly opens you to your own to the reminder and the energy that your life, your body, your spirit is sovereign and no one owns the land that is your life. And that's part of the devotional ritual that I just recited. When you're working with the sword of Nuadu, it represents the life force that's always in us, but often gets forgotten and can be re-energized when you invoke the sword. The Spear of Lu, and this I'm not telling the whole story here, but there's a story behind each of these, which is why I did a chapter for each of them. The Spear of Lu reminds us that we are already gifted and skilled people. We have to own our gifts and our skills. Are we willing to do that? Maybe one of the biggest challenges for people on a modern path is to acknowledge and to own and to agree and to affirm, I have some skills. I have some gifts, things that I'm good at. And today I own them and today I will use them. And the Spear of Lu opens us to that reality. Um, and then the cauldron of the Dagda is a portal through to abundance, to the abundance of source, to the abundance of spirit that is always there, but which we frequently tune out of. So the four talismans act as portals that help us tune back in to spiritual realities that are always with us. Um, I'm currently reading a book by Suzanne Giesemann, who is fond of saying we are both human and spirit all the time, but we frequently forget the second part. And I think for me, that's a great way of saying this is the value of the four talismans. They tune us in to sovereignty, to life force, to giftedness, and to abundance. And those are things that any of us, regardless of what we do, can use and be empowered by every single day.
In reading the manuscript that I had the chance to read, and in hearing you talk so far in our conversation, it sounds like even someone who may not be exploring ancient Irish legend or modern Druid spirituality, I was I was kind of impressed how you provided this blueprint for someone who may not be on those paths to perhaps explore their own cultural backgrounds, look for stories, and develop their own sense of spirituality, their own path. Um, do you think that is something that, do you think that anybody reading your book, no matter their background, may be able to find some benefit from it in that regard?
I hope so. I hope that it's a both and kind of thing. That for some people, I had somebody ask me this week for some resources about how to step more deeply into modern Druidry, and I told them about my book that was coming out. I said, it's based on this story that you might find useful, and their face lit up, and they wanted to know more. So I think for that sort of person who's looking for a connection with Druidry or a connection with Irish or Celtic cultural material, it's going to be a rich book. I also think that it's kind of like a paradigm. And this kind of hails back to what we did in my ritual class this past semester. If there's a story out of your own ethnic, cultural, human tradition or religious tradition, if there's a story that speaks deeply to you, then create a devotion out of it. Here's a way to create a devotion out of a story like that. And I think what I've done then becomes a paradigm. You don't have to use this story, you don't have to use this devotion, but take the story that is calling to you and create a devotion out of it. And you can just look at what I've done as a paradigm for how to do that. And if you work with that devotion long enough around your story, it will become initiatory. It will begin to shape you by itself and invite you into what you might or might not call magic, invite you into an art of change for your own life, for your relationships, and other sorts of things. So I hope that it's that kind of thing that you're describing. I hope that it's something that individuals can read and make use of one way or the other.
Mm. I love that you said that, create a devotion, because I think a lot of times many people exploring paganism or spirituality, they look for what is. They look for the thing that already is established so that they can follow. Few people have the inspiration to say, what could be? What could I take that is now and make it something else, something better, something my own?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I love the fact that this kind of it kind of gives permission to the audience to, like you said earlier, with great respect, to play in their spirituality, to explore and to read other ideas.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that when we are creative, especially around meaning in our lives, when we are creative, we are as tuned into our spirit selves as we can be. That creativity is just so powerful.
right. Yeah, I believe it. And you also you do hit on active imagination in the book, which I think I would call it something like a visualization. Um, uh, is that do you think very critical? Because I know many people struggle with, just sitting still in their own silence. Is that something maybe you had to deal with as you were exploring the devotional practice? Or what advice might you have for someone who perhaps struggles?
Yeah, I think that all of us bring some sort of struggle to more contemplative practices to um, whether we call it meditation or sitting in silence or centering prayer, something like that. But I'm not stuck on a form. I love to go for a walk and I can engage my imagination and let's say that I've not been feeling well and I want to really spend some time with the sword of Nwadu, which also conveys an energy of healing. I can go for a walk in a park or in my neighborhood or in the woods behind my house and strike up that conversation with the sword and tell it I'm interested in figuring out what's going on with my body. I don't feel well in my name of body part, whatever it happens to be. What message do you have for me? And then just keep walking. And what'll begin to happen is that images or words or ideas will begin to bubble up, and I'll realize, oh, it's talking to me. This is this is the sword responding. There are some people who don't form mental images, and I don't see that as a hindrance at all. It just means that you won't be working in images. You might be working in words or ideas. Some people work best when they're writing, journaling, So if that's you, then engage this kind of active imagination with a pen and paper in front of you. Maybe you do that best with some sort of art form. I have friends who must doodle or must be drawing when they're engaging their active imagination. So I think there are a number of ways of doing this, and it's about finding the right way for you. But I think the I think active imagination um, is just a really powerful tool, and it's simple, so it also allows for some variation.
I believe you have an engagement to discuss some of the topics that we've been talking about coming up in June, Mystic South. Out of curiosity, have you given any thought to what attendees there what you might share with them?
Sure. Actually, it's in July. Mystic South is in July in Atlanta. Um, so, of course, I'm tempted to try and give them the entire book in a 90-minute session, and that's not going to happen. So, what I really would like to do is to be able to briefly introduce them to the story of the Tuatha Dé Danann and their venture to the Northern Islands to study magic. And then I would like to introduce them in a guided meditation sort of way to each of the four talismans, and allow them to have a few minutes of experience with each of them with a little feedback, sort of talk back in the group about what they're experiencing, what they're seeing. and then finish by telling them a little bit about the book and what it might hold for them if they're interested in it. And it's interesting. I was supposed to do this workshop last summer, um, and as you well know, I was only maybe a third, maybe a half into the writing of the manuscript. So the book was it didn't exist. But my work on the material was years in the making. So I had proposed this workshop, they had accepted it. And at the last minute, it became clear that I had to go in the hospital for some surgery and wasn't going to be able to go to Mystic South at all. So I contacted them and said, look, I can't be there. And they were really lovely. They said, oh, we're so sorry. Next year, when you propose this workshop again, and let us remind us that you had to bow out because of surgery, and we'll assure that you get in. So I did that. And of course now I'm actually going to give the workshop with all things going well, and there's an actual book to go along with it. So that sort of timing was interesting all by itself.
Yeah, that's great. I'm excited for you. Um, for anyone who has never been to Mystic South or heard of it, it's basically an event, a gathering of pagans. It's more, I wouldn't say academic. It's not that, I guess, strict, but people talk about doctrines and paths, and it's basically a place for pagans of different varieties to come together and share. And that happens every year. If you happen to go in person this year, our executive director, Holly Emore, should be there representing Cherry Hill. And of course, you'll be there, Rob. So I do recommend the audience, if you've never heard of Mystic South, do check it out.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and and so you said years in the making, and I know for me, I've got a warehouse of ideas that I want to put on paper. After the Four Talismans, do you have are there any plans for another book, or are you kind of giving it to the world and letting them take it where they will?
Well, I'm giving it to the world to see where they take it. I also do have it's interesting. I If you had asked me 3 years ago, is there a book? I would have told you something different. I, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, I did a workshop at Mystic South on the three cauldrons. And that's another fragmentary document that I mentioned earlier. And I really want to do some writing about the three realms, which is a way of looking at the world shared by many indigenous cultures, and this Irish fragment called Cauldron of Poesy, which talks about the three cauldrons within. So I think that if I venture down the writing path again, it will be around those three, the three realms and the three cauldrons.
Uh, that is that is wonderful. I got a little bit of a sense of excitement inside of me because after the first book that I had the chance to read, I felt a little hungry for more, even though ancient Irish tradition and modern Druid spirituality is really not a path that I walk personally. I always
Mhm.
love learning about different traditions, different ideas, different implementations. Um, so I would be very, very excited if I could read another of your works, but no
Uh,
pressure.
no, but that means a lot. I appreciate that, Arnold.
Okay, good. So I think we've given the audience a pretty good overview of what they can expect from the book. If they're fortunate enough to go to Mystic South, what they can expect from that. Um, do you have, are there any other projects or pet projects that you might be working on that you would like to share with the audience? Or is there a way for them to explore more about you? Are you on Facebook or a website or something?
I am on Facebook. I have a website, which is connected to something else that I'm passionate about. I have a practice in spiritual direction. Um, my website is Core Connection, CORConnectation.us, coreconnection.us. And there are pages there about me, about this work in spiritual direction. Um,
Can
and
you explain that? what is spiritual direction?
Sure, spiritual direction is an ancient practice that has been engaged in by many traditions. It is the practice of sitting with another human being while they explore meaning and questions of ultimacy with you. And the spiritual director's role, sometimes we call ourselves spiritual companions or spiritual friends. The term is variable. My role is to listen deeply, as deeply as I can, and to be alert for things that stand out that either need more attention or that make some connections with other things that the person has said. And it is a delightful process of witnessing the work of spirit in another person's life. That's really what it is. It's witnessing the work of spirit in another person's life. I Every time I have a session with somebody, and all my work is done online, I don't meet people in person just because this opens up the possibility to so many other people. Before I work with a client online, I light a candle in this room where I work, and I just say something like this: Source, you're manifest in my client, you're manifest in me, you're manifest in the space between us. I want to be open to what you're doing. And that's how I begin a session. That's what I see myself trying to do and to offer to a client as they come in to talk about what's really meaningful in their lives. Sometimes it's very painful, sometimes it's really joyful. Sometimes it's a mix of those things.
What do you think is the kind of state a person might find themselves in that would push them to reach out to a spiritual director like you? I
Yeah.
am hesitant to say the word lost, but I think that's what I'm trying to ask. What do you find is the common thread among the people you help as a spiritual director?
Yeah, I actually asked that question up front when we're trying to decide if we're a good fit to work together. And almost always there's some version of I'm at a place in my life where I need to figure something out. I keep reusing this phrase because it's important to me. It's some version of I'm trying to make sense, I'm trying to make meaning of fill in the blank, and then they have their thing. It could be that they've come to a stage in life where things are changing, jobs are changing, relationships are changing. Maybe they're entering retirement or taking on a work they've never done before. Um, I do some work, not often, but some of my clients are couples, and they come because they want to appreciate and respect and honor one another more deeply and do that together rather than as individuals. But it's all about meaning making. It's about what's important in my life, what's meaningful in my life, and it's one of the things that I've learned about talking about the divine. I'm comfortable talking about the divine. I use words like spirit and source and God. But somebody could come to spiritual direction who says, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a God. That's fine. Tell me what's important in your life. Tell me what's meaningful in your life. Because for me, to talk about what's meaningful in our lives is our connection to spirituality, regardless of your religious affiliation.
One more time, what's your website if anybody wants to reach out to you for
Yeah,
information on that?
yeah, it's all one word, core connection, CORConnection.us. By the way, I haven't misspelled the word core. Core is the Latin word that means heart. So, so the website is really Heart Connection, but it's Core Connection without an E, Core Connection, all one word, .us.
Okay, then that's all wonderful information, Robert. We have been talking for about an hour. Are there any last parting thoughts or messages for the audience before we start wrapping up?
Oh, I just encourage people to go after what's important and meaningful to you and see what it has to show you.
Wonderful. And one more time, the name of your book again, which will be fully released. It should be fully released by the time this episode is published. The name of the book is again is The Four Talismans Devotion, Initiation, and Magic by Dr. Robert Patrick. Robert, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to the audience for listening. If you found this episode to be of value, please consider making a donation to Cherry Hill Seminary at cherryhillseminary.org. If you'd like to learn more about the courses or certificates or degree programs that we offer, visit cherryhillseminary.org/academics. Thank you so much to everyone for listening. Thank you again, Robert, for joining me. Until next time, everybody. Bye.